Emergency services were contacted to report a break-in and a homicide. The caller, George Tia, expressed distress as he discovered his wife, Shauna, lying on the floor, unresponsive and covered in blood. Accompanied by their 8-year-old daughter, George had arrived at their home to find the garage door ajar, which prompted him to investigate further. Upon entering the residence, he was met with the tragic sight of his wife, who had already succumbed to her injuries. When asked about the last time he had seen her, George, a firefighter, indicated that he had been at work the previous day and had last seen Shauna approximately 36 hours prior. In that brief span, the lives of George and his daughter were irrevocably altered. Although George and Shauna were estranged, they remained married, and he was now faced with the daunting task of navigating the aftermath of her death. The case took an unexpected turn with the emergence of burglary surveillance footage and a startling accusation. The narrative surrounding Shauna Tia's tragic murder began to unfold. On the early morning of September 29, 2012, Shauna, a cocktail waitress, was recorded on CCTV as she clocked out of her shift at the Palms Casino at 3:01 a.m. This would mark the final moments of her life captured on camera. After a 30-minute drive home, she entered through the garage and moved quietly through the house, opting not to turn on the lights, eager to rest after a long night of work. As she proceeded down the hallway towards the stairs, an unforeseen danger awaited her in the darkness, a figure armed with a hammer, ready to strike. She raised her hands in front of her face in a futile attempt to shield herself, but her assailant brutally broke her fingers and then struck her with a hammer until she succumbed to her injuries. This was the scene that George Tia discovered at 9:00 a.m. the following morning. The mother of his child had been horrifically murdered in her own living room. The questions of why and who was responsible for this heinous act lingered. To understand more about Shauna, we must delve into her background. Her story begins in Salt Lake City, Utah, where she was born in March 1966. Raised in a devout Mormon family alongside her sister and 5 brothers, the family remained in Utah until she was 12, after which they relocated to Pennsylvania and subsequently Virginia. There, she attended South Lakes High School, where she was well liked and recognized for her vivacious personality as a cheerleader. Graduating in 1984, she appeared poised for a promising future on the East Coast. However, perhaps yearning for the desert landscape of her youth, she returned to Las Vegas, Nevada, in 1994 at the age of 28. The dazzling allure of Sin City stood in stark contrast to her Mormon upbringing. She moved to be closer to her sister Paula, but Las Vegas is not typically associated with family-friendly activities. Initially employed in upscale retail establishments such as Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, she soon set her sights on the lucrative resort and casino industry, which often attracts a diverse array of individuals. A few years after her arrival, she secured a position as a cocktail waitress at the Fiesta, and from there, she was fortunate enough to obtain the same role at the Palms Hotel Casino. In 2001, Shauna began her career, finding it both glamorous and exhilarating. She regarded her colleagues as family, with one co-worker noting that Shauna was always cheerful, never seen without a smile, and perpetually laughing. Her enthusiasm for cocktailing made the job not only thrilling but also fulfilling. Shauna earned nearly $100,000 annually from her salary and tips, which were frequently given in the form of casino chips in Las Vegas, functioning similarly to cash. On a good night, she could earn around $500, which in 2024 would equate to nearly $850. For Shauna, Las Vegas was not merely a party destination, it represented a land of opportunity. She enjoyed earning money and spending it, but that is a topic for another time. It was at the Palms in 2002 where she met her husband, George Tia. Born in September 1972, George was 6 years younger than Shauna and grew up on a chicken ranch. After losing his father at a young age, he was instilled with a strong work ethic. This dedication led him to graduate as valedictorian of his high school class before attending the United States Military Academy at West Point. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers, constructing schools and water systems in developing countries. However, upon leaving the military, he found civilian engineering work in an office to be unfulfilling, prompting him to become a firefighter in Las Vegas. George was described as charismatic and embodying an all-American spirit. He was a devoted family man who supported his mother, who cared for his disabled sister, demonstrating his strong sense of responsibility. Shauna was captivated by George's striking appearance, particularly after he was featured in a firefighter pin-up calendar. Their initial meeting at the Palms in 2002 sparked an immediate connection, and it was no surprise that they quickly fell in love. A year later, they welcomed their daughter, and 3 years after that, they celebrated their marriage in a beautiful beach ceremony in Hawaii on March 16, 2006, just 3 days following Shauna's 40th birthday. The photographs from that day captured a joyful couple, seemingly perfect and blissfully unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. However, in 2008, circumstances shifted dramatically, not only for George and Shauna but for millions of individuals across the United States and around the globe. This year marked the onset of the Great Recession, the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1920s. The recession caused unemployment rates to soar above 10%, primarily triggered by the collapse of the housing bubble, which had a particularly devastating impact on Las Vegas, a city heavily dependent on tourism and the casino industry, both of which require customers to have disposable income. The construction sector also faced significant setbacks, leading to widespread foreclosures and an alarming unemployment rate of 14% in the city. The financial crisis did not spare the Tfaz family. George experienced substantial losses due to the housing market collapse, prompting the family to make significant lifestyle adjustments to cope with their new reality. This shift in circumstances led to increased tensions at home, as George began to exhibit jealousy and controlling behavior. He made disparaging remarks about Shauna's attire for work in front of their impressionable young daughter, which deeply troubled her. Shauna was particularly sensitive to the criticisms leveled by George regarding her spending habits, especially in situations where their daughter could overhear. This only intensified the conflict, as Shauna was accustomed to earning her own income through demanding shifts as a cocktail waitress, allowing her the freedom to spend as she pleased. Additionally, Shauna expressed her discomfort with a man named George had employed for various tasks around the house. Although George seemed to be offering assistance to this homeless individual, Shauna found him unsettling and felt uneasy in his presence. Over time, the marriage deteriorated further. After a decade together and 6 years of marriage, Shauna reached her breaking point and decided to leave their family home in April 2012. They began sharing custody of their daughter, but the arrangement proved challenging due to Shauna's long night shifts and George's equally demanding work as an EMT and firefighter. Consequently, their daughter spent considerable time with George's mother, who lived nearby. Perhaps for the sake of their daughter, or perhaps due to her idealistic nature, Shauna was reluctant to abandon the marriage. She had realized her dreams of working in the vibrant atmosphere of the city and was not ready to relinquish her charming husband or the beautiful family they had built. With a sense of optimism, she persuaded George to attend marriage counseling. They dedicated the summer to addressing their issues, but by early September, Shauna's life took a turn for the worse when her townhouse was burglarized. The intruder not only used her shower but also stole her wedding ring. A pair of her bathing suit bottoms was not the only item left behind by the burglar. A pair of small boxer shorts was also discovered. The break-in had understandably left Shauna, known for her optimistic outlook, feeling terrified. Despite this, she chose not to enhance her home security, convinced that such an incident would not recur. Unfortunately, she was mistaken. Just 3 weeks later, on the early morning of September 29, she left work at 3:00 a.m. Feeling exhausted and overwhelmed by her marriage, the challenges of parenting her 8-year-old daughter, and the recent burglary. Lacking the energy to remain alert, she could not have anticipated that someone would be lurking in the darkness, armed and waiting for her. The injury to the side of her head was so severe that the paramedics, responding to George's frantic 911 call, initially believed she had been shot. This act appeared to be premeditated and ruthless, aimed at ending her life. The police quickly turned their attention to George, as husbands are often the primary suspects in cases of domestic conflict. However, George had an alibi, which he communicated to the operator and later to the officers who arrived at the scene. He described finding her on the floor, covered in blood, expressing his despair. When asked about his work schedule, he revealed that he had completed a 24-hour shift at the firehouse and had been on call throughout the night. Their daughter had spent the night at her grandmother's, and George had picked her up in the morning, stopping by Shauna's house at her request. A chance encounter led them to discover a horrific scene, and George was ruled out as the perpetrator due to his alibi. Consequently, the investigation quickly reached an impasse, as there were no substantial suspects aside from George. Interviews with Shauna's colleagues yielded little information, revealing only that she was a kind, cheerful individual, a dedicated employee, and someone who would be deeply missed. The police began to entertain the possibility that a predator was targeting women in the neighborhood, particularly those employed at the casino, leading to heightened fears among them. The burglary at Shauna's residence raised suspicions, although investigators could not determine if it was connected to the murder. However, 2 days into their inquiry, they received a significant lead. A man named William Penks, known as Big Will, approached them with crucial information regarding the case. Having lived in Las Vegas for many years and working as a maintenance man at an apartment complex, he led a law-abiding life and sought to assist others, including a friend he referred to as Greyhound. Greyhound, who lived in a tent in the foothills, led a starkly different existence from the opulence typically associated with Las Vegas. Will had been aiding him in his efforts to turn his life around, but one day in September, Greyhound approached Will with a startling confession. He stated, "I have something to tell you," to which Will inquired about the nature of the revelation. Greyhound then claimed, "I just murdered a woman." According to Will, Greyhound appeared devoid of remorse, seemingly content with the completion of his grim task and the prospect of a reward. The individual repeatedly struck the woman with a hammer until the tool broke. Subsequently, Will contacted the police. Initially, the officers were skeptical, considering it too convenient as a lead in their investigation. However, they pursued it nonetheless. Greyhound had a history of stealing food from an Albertsons grocery store, prompting the investigators to accompany Will to the location to ascertain where he had last been seen. Will was also aware that Greyhound occasionally sold drugs at the adjacent gas station, but they did not require witness statements to locate him. Ultimately, Will spotted Greyhound on the street. The police approached him and discovered drugs in his possession, which allowed the investigators to take him to the police station. Greyhound's true identity was revealed to be N.L. Stevens, who vehemently denied having confessed to Will about murdering a woman with a hammer. Lacking a confession, the police sought physical evidence to connect Stevens to the crime. They initiated a search for his campsite, combing through miles of desert in Las Vegas on foot and via helicopter. Eventually, they located Noel's campsite in the foothills, approximately 8 miles from the Vegas Strip, where they uncovered the evidence they had been seeking, a rolled-up pair of Stevens's pants, partially concealed under a bush, which were stained with blood. The investigators conducted DNA testing on site, and when the results returned, the truth became evident: Noel was implicated in Shauna's murder, as the blood belonged to her. They intended to use this information during NL's interrogation, informing him that a witness had come forward claiming he had killed Shauna, although they were exaggerating, as Will was unaware of this development. Shauna's identity was known to Noel, who later admitted to having concealed himself in her residence, waiting to ambush her with a hammer upon her return from work in the early hours of September 29th. However, a significant question lingered: how could this homeless ex-convict possibly know Shauna, let alone possess a motive for her murder? The police scrutinized Noel's cell phone for potential evidence, and what they discovered was astonishing, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the investigation. They uncovered the contact number of George, a firefighter, and when they inquired about his identity, Noel referred to him as a friend who occasionally hired him for various tasks around the house. This revelation connected the dots. Noel was the homeless individual George had introduced to Shauna for domestic assistance, the very person who had made her feel uneasy. Tragically, her killer was someone she had recognized, and she had sensed a threat from him. The question then arose, what was George's involvement in this situation? On the day of the murder, Shauna's sister, Paula, harbored her own suspicions. After learning of Shauna's death, she and her husband contacted George, recording their conversation. "Hello George, this is Paula. Can you explain what has happened? My sister has passed away. What did they do to her?" George, who was with a grief counselor at the time, responded, "I don't know, she's lying on the floor." He was positioned just outside Shauna's home during this brief exchange. Following this, he handed the phone to the grief counselor, who continued the conversation with Paula and her husband. However, Paula was not in a state to receive comfort. She felt compelled to voice her suspicions, ensuring that no one else could overhear her words. "I have strong reasons to believe that her husband may be implicated in this matter, based on numerous discussions I have had with my sister. I have a significant suspicion regarding his involvement." Initially, this concern was not taken seriously, primarily because George had a seemingly unassailable alibi for the time of the murder. It was more convenient to attribute the crime to a homeless ex-convict like Noel Stevens rather than to a respectable citizen and firefighter like George Tfa. However, the two individuals appeared to be linked. Investigators found that Noel's cell phone records indicated he and George had communicated 87 times in the previous month, suggesting a relationship that extended beyond mere acquaintanceship. They had first met while living on the same street, prior to Noel relocating to the desert. He had been residing with his sister just a few doors down from George and Shauna, and their relationship developed as Noel performed odd jobs for the Tfa family, a practice that continued even after he became homeless. Noel admired George, who exuded charisma and an aura of success, despite facing financial difficulties following the housing market collapse. Consequently, when George offered him $600 with the promise of additional funds to eliminate Shauna, Noel accepted the proposition. Initially, Noel informed the police that they had considered staging an accident, where he would strike Shauna on the head and then drive her car into a wall. However, an autopsy would likely reveal the head injury, raising suspicions. They also contemplated suffocating her with a plastic bag, but Noel expressed concern about leaving behind his DNA if he were to get scratched during the act. According to Noel, George suggested the idea of committing the crime. A homicide occurred at the Palms, prompting the creation of a map that indicated where Shauna had parked her vehicle. However, when Noel scaled the wall into the parking area, he was taken aback by the heightened security typical of a casino environment and fled the scene. Ultimately, the duo decided that Shauna's residence was the most suitable location for their meticulously orchestrated crime. George provided Noel with a key, which he used to survey the premises approximately 20 times, including a break-in 3 weeks prior to the assault. This incident was characterized as a mysterious burglary during which he pilfered her jewelry and undergarments. It was not an isolated event but rather a precursor to a far more sinister plan devised by her own spouse. Investigators later uncovered surveillance footage showing George and Noel at Lowe's purchasing a hammer, a knife, and gloves just weeks before Shauna's demise. Noel subsequently directed the authorities to the location where he had buried the hammer, which had been used in the attack. The violence of the assault was such that the hammer's handle had broken in two, and it bore a barcode linking it to Lowe's, providing compelling evidence of George's involvement. 9 days following Shauna's murder, on October 8, 2012, investigators presented this evidence to George's family, who reacted with shock and disbelief. After this meeting, George's sister contacted him, likely to inform him of the police's suspicions. In response, George dropped his daughter off at his mother's home and fled in his truck, speeding through city traffic onto the Summerlin Parkway, where he accelerated to 90 mph and crashed into a barrier without any skid marks, leading authorities to believe it was a suicide attempt. He survived the incident due to unforeseen circumstances. George T.F., while lying in his hospital bed and wearing a seatbelt, faced charges for the murder of his wife at the police station. Null Stevens was also charged and entered a guilty plea in 2013, agreeing to testify in exchange for prosecutors not pursuing the death penalty against him. However, for the prosecution to establish that George was the instigator, Null needed to be a credible witness. Despite having a stutter caused by stress, he confessed that there were times he doubted his own statements, yet he proceeded to testify. When questioned about his relationship with George, Null mentioned their collaborative efforts, stating they had worked on various matters together. He admitted to breaking into Shauna's home and leaving behind a pair of boxers as a preliminary act before the actual murder. When asked who instructed him to stage it as a robbery, he recounted a moment when he emerged from a door holding a hammer, recalling Shauna's inquiry about his actions. Null's testimony proved to be the final blow for George T.F. Although Null acknowledged his history of hallucinations and personal struggles, the intricacy of the plot suggested it was unlikely he had fabricated it. He also informed the court that leaving the garage door open was a prearranged signal for George, indicating that the task had been completed when he visited the house the following morning. This detail became even more disturbing considering that George had brought his 8-year-old daughter to Shauna's residence that day. Notably, George chose not to testify in his defense. The sole witness in his defense was his sister, who attested to his good character and peaceful disposition. However, this testimony proved insufficient. On September 3, 2015, George was convicted on all charges, including first-degree murder, and subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment in December 2015. In 2017, he sought to appeal the conviction, drafting a 100-page handwritten petition himself after his attorney withdrew from the case, likely due to the claims made in the appeal regarding ineffective legal representation. George contended that he had been adversely affected by medication for an injury sustained while serving as a firefighter and asserted that he had received a divine message instructing him to kill Shauna to protect his daughter. This appeal was ultimately denied. The court's response indicated that George had meticulously planned the murder while simultaneously caring for his daughter and maintaining a cordial relationship with the victim to evade suspicion regarding her death. Given the careful deception and determination involved in this scheme, the appellant failed to establish a reasonable likelihood that he would have been acquitted or received a more lenient sentence. Law enforcement and prosecutors believed the motive was financial, as investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that George attempted to conceal money through his mother. The strains in their marriage reportedly began during the Great Recession and revolved around Shauna's spending habits. This, it appeared, was the impetus for George's cold and calculated decision to hire an assassin to murder his wife. In 2023, George and Shauna's daughter graduated from high school, having lived with her grandmother since the tragic events of 2012. This narrative evokes deep sorrow and raises questions about the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of choices made in moments of desperation.